they're Bible believing in some sense. They believe Jesus is their Savior, but they start sounding like the people around them. So, we're called to be salt and light as Christians to the culture and to the world. But in this strange way, you have some of these Christian leaders who actually, rather than trying to bring Christ to the world, they actually become missionaries from the world to their fellow Christians.
On the broadcast today, we have Dr. John West. John is the Vice President and a Senior Fellow of the Seattle-based Discovery Institute. He also serves as the Managing Director for the Institute, and his vita, as always, will be in our show notes if you want to read more about him. The most recent book, which we're talking about today, is the Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, but he's also written a number of books about Darwin and C.S. Lewis and others. So once you hear Dr. West, you're going to want to know more about him. But John, thanks for the time on the program. This is an incredible text, and I'm thoroughly enjoying reading it. And so just thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Michael, for having me. I really felt called to write the book, and so it's good that it's getting out there now. So,
well, brand new publication, 2025, and you and Megan Basham kind of hit an interesting time in our publishing cycle. Let's say Megan's book, Shepherd for Sale. We've had her on the program, and you obviously cite her in your text as well. As always, give us the why you wrote the book preface.
Yeah, as theologically sort of committed Christians, especially evangelical Christians, I think we look around society and see how bad things are going, and we like to point the finger to the big bad atheists or agnostics, and I think that certainly, there's a lot of truth to that. But the more I looked around, especially when I was a professor at a Christian college, and the more sort of in my work, began to see how the number of personally committed Christians in leadership positions who themselves were facilitating many of the things that we're concerned about. And that troubled me. And it sort of caused me to go on a journey and to reflect on that. And what I was seeing, I think, really is encapsulated in the idea of Stockholm Syndrome, where you basically have Christians and Christian leaders who are becoming more like the surrounding world around them and being influenced by their cultural captors, if you will, than they are by their historic beliefs. And so it really was, like I said, trying to diagnose where we are as a society with our culture really going to the sewer, unfortunately, and a lot of people's broken lives being the result of that, and looking at, well, what is the responsibility of actually Christians themselves? Have we actually helped facilitate those things? And so it's not just the big bad secularists. We sort of need to get our own house in order.
Interesting observations along the way. We have noticed how cultures. I've basically been a local churchman for over 40 years, and how the culture impacted the church versus the church being a witness and an opportunity for the culture. But for folks that they may have heard the phrase Stockholm Syndrome but don't know the connection, let me just read the definition that you have in the beginning of your book: the psychological tendency of a hostage to bond with, identify with, or sympathize with his or her captor. And it's a great way to talk about how we see a leader or an organization or a board or even just a loud voice start changing their position, and how people fall in line. And I always appreciate an author, not so much when they name names and take hostages, but when they give citations for what these folks are doing and saying, and you do a great job of that. Let me just scan the introduction for folks that to encourage them to take a look at the book if it's of interest to them. But you talk about one of the largest evangelical mega churches and how that leader, and we'll just name Andy. Andy's a classmate of mine, a friend of mine. We've addressed this before. One of the leading scientists, Francis Collins, born again politicians, and others. So you take these head on, and I guess as I ask other authors, where do you think these guys got off to begin with? Because there seems to be some defining time that they start shifting the message.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and to some extent, I think there are differences depending on the people. But I think, in general, Especially if you're a Christian leader. So whether you're being the media or government or academia or the arts and entertainment, in order to get there and in order to get that position of leadership, you've spent your career and life, whether it be in graduate school, whether it be with your peer groups, surrounded by people who really are not sympathetic to Bible-believing Christianity. And I think that there are some different ways you can take that. You can, if you have a lot of backbone and you naturally push back, then you might not be influenced by that. But another natural thing is if you're surrounded by people who have really different assumptions and are hostile to Orthodox Christianity, I mean, maybe they're not personally hostile, but in their belief systems, that ends up rubbing off on you and you end up identifying with them. And so I think that is especially the more you get into being looked up to in culture, the more influential you are, the more you end up being influenced by the surrounding culture around you. And I think that is true for a lot of people. I'm not trying to judge people's hearts, but I am. The issue is if they're sounding like or acting like more like the hostile, people hostile to Christianity around them, then, that becomes apparent. And so I do think, when they start taking cues from the people around them, and it's not, these are, what I'm largely talking about are people who are personally sincere. So they're Bible believing in some sense, they believe Jesus is their savior, but they start sounding like the people around them. So, we're called to be salt and light as Christians to the culture and to the world. But in this strange way, you have some of these Christian leaders who actually, rather than trying to bring Christ to the world, they actually become missionaries from the world to their fellow Christians. And it's because they seem to actually believe, like, let's take Andy Stanley, who, I think believes in Christ, sincere, Christian. But if you read his book, Irresistible, or listen to his sermons, the sorts of things he's articulating seems to be that he really has bought into many of the claims of the people who really can't stand Christianity. So in the core of his book, Irresistible, which I give sort of a detailed discussion in my book, is that the Bible, especially the Old Testament, but he actually says, overall, the Bible is no longer defensible in the public square. Now, where are you getting that from? You're not getting that from historic Christianity. You're not getting that from, there's a whole school of Christian apologetics. The Bible is actually defensible in the public square. But why is he saying that? Well, I think he is actually bought into a lot of the claims of the secularists, the progressive theologians, others. And even though he personally clings to the Christian faith, he actually believes, he's actually listened to them and adopted their assumptions that the Bible can't be defended in the public square. And so you shouldn't even try. And I think that's sad, but I think that's a direct sort of indication of what's happening when you have Christian leaders who are listening so much to the culture that they're supposed to be ministering to, and they end up adopting, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes explicitly, the assumptions of the surrounding secular cultural elites.
It's interesting when we talk about the church impacting the culture or vice versa. The thing I've noticed, and it's just anecdotal, is there's an acquiescence of language. And, intolerant is a key trigger, or hateful, or certain words. And the way these things are defined and nuanced, even when you and I were younger, it was pro-life and pro-abortion. No, it's pro-choice. No, it's women's rights. And so these things get nuanced. And I think the frog in the kettle happens in a weird way, that these leaders, a word you used earlier, don't have backbone to smile, to disagree, and say, yeah, I hear that, but I just disagree. And this is why I disagree. One of the things you point out early in the book was about, and part of this for folks that don't know your story, as a professor, you encountered this at Seattle Pacific, but you talked about engaging the culture, changing the world. And that one jumped off the page at me because I have fought a number of seminary professors and let's say, spokespeople over this engaging the culture nomenclature. I go, where does it say to engage the culture? we're to share the gospel, we're to make disciples, we're to, help people along their faith journey, but we're not to engage the culture. Your thought, your response?
Yeah. So I spent 12 years in Christian higher education. Seattle Pacific, a lot of people may not know it, but it's a member of the Christian colleges and universities, main group, along with Wheaton College and others. It was founded by a Free Methodist in the 19th century and was a really strong evangelical presence in secular Seattle for over 100 years. But then in the 12 years that I was there, I began to see a real transformation. And, one of it was this slogan, engage the culture, change the world, which I actually at the time as a young faculty member thought, oh, that's great. We should interact with the culture in that we should try to influence it. But the problem that I saw was what the slogan meant to most people on our campus, or at least what became clear over a decade, is that engage the culture really meant join in arms with the culture, and that, if you were praised by the New York Times or if you were praised by the secular culture, that was the
objective. Yeah.
That was the objective. And so it wasn't really, it was more engage the culture, be changed by the world. It really wasn't. And interestingly, the earlier slogan or motto of my school when I got there was wholeness in truth, which, Christianity is truth, and you want to be aligned with the truth, and true wholeness comes from that. And so, but the switch to the new slogan, engaging the culture, changing the world, what was an interesting change of language. So I think you're exactly right. Getting back to something you earlier said about people do need to watch the use and manipulation of language. And I do have a chapter on the signs of sort of wisdom and discernment, and I talk about the manipulation of language. And that is certainly a way that a lot of people go astray is, for example, love. Love is a very deep Christian concept, but it's not the love of the world. It's not simply, Christian love is not, not giving offense no matter what. It's actually seeing, people's deepest needs and trying to minister to that. And sometimes that means that you have to tell them things they may not want to hear in the short term. And so, long-term Christian love is different than what often is, discussed today as love. And, I think actually another thing in the Christian circles that I write about later that is, growing up as an evangelical Christian, especially in the last couple of decades, have heard a lot about how Christianity is relational. And that's true. And it is true that it's especially, a relationship with each other and with the living God and with Jesus. So that's true. Yet you have to be careful because, often the way that's described today is it's used as a counterbalance to being aligned with the truth. Well, Christianity is relational, so you can't just say those things or you can't just articulate truth. Christianity is relational. And what people don't realize is that relationships are not the be-all, end-all. I mean, two of the most human institutions that are most relationally based are gangs and the mafia, and where personal relationships and personal loyalty is everything. And I think people can understand that that is dysfunctional at a certain point. So, yes, relationships are important, and certainly Christianity is a living relationship with the living God. But if you're using that slogan, Christianity is relational, as a way of denying that we are called to stand for truth lovingly, in our families, in our churches, in our society, then I think, again, that's a concept that can go astray.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have the same beef with a lot of Christianity. The spiritual formation is the one that sends me on edge. I'm like, we use this, a personal relationship with Jesus. I remember in seminary, one of my best theological buddies going, this isn't even in the Bible. The phrase, you're right, it's an accurate phrase, but it's not the clearest phrase. And we would often talk about the way Jesus revealed himself in the Gospels of John. If you look at the 7 I Ams in the Gospel of John, they're all individual. They're unique to a different person, the woman at the well, the blind man, Nicodemus. I said, why don't we do what Christ did? Why do we have to have spiritual formation? Discipleship's a good word. Anyway, I digress. Let's talk about, you pointed out, and it made me stand up and smile because I actually read one of the books you talked about, Gresham Nation's book, Christianity and Liberalism. And that was a foundational book, John. And today...
Yeah, what I stress is that Christians over the past 2,000 years, there's always we're still in a sinful world. We are still torn by our sinful nature, and so Christians always have to be concerned about staying true to the faith and to defending really the gospel truth. And so what we're writing about now, or what I'm writing about now, a sort of current indictment. It's not that this hasn't happened before. It has, and so one of the times in the early 20th century, certainly by the 1920s and 30s, you had a lot of today what are called the mainline denominations that are, unfortunately, sadly, many of them are I say post-Christian, where they've really rejected the major truths of the faith. Well, that was happening in the early 20th century, and but the reason why God was very gracious and raised up people like J. Gresham Machen, and then a few decades later, I would count Francis Schaeffer, who I actually dedicated the book to. Yeah, that God would raise up people to actually try to call people back to the faithful, the true faith, and they had an influence. And because of that, although, say, the mainline denominations are no longer, in many senses, many of them are no longer really Christian, in my view, nonetheless, there were a lot of evangelical Christians who ended up reviving because of the work of Machen and others. And so I think this is something that we can't just live off the past. And that I think in America, we've been fortunate over our history to have quite a few people who have called Christians back to, the authentic faith. Mm-hmm. But it's something each generation really needs to do because, in fact, Abraham Lincoln, who sadly was not a Christian, but he had or maybe by the very end of his life, I don't know, but he was never confirmed as a Christian. But he did say something in one of his famous lectures that I think every Christian should pay attention to, which is, it was on the perpetuation of institutions. And that, founding a good institution is important, really key important, but transmitting it to the next generation, that can be really hard. And so on the perpetuation, he was talking about our civic institutions, sort of the American government and founding, but I'd say on the church, are transmitting it to the next generation, that can be hard. And it's something that I think Christians do need to spend more emphasis on. And discipleship is a good word, as you say, because that's a lot about what it's out. But we can't just rest on our laurels or assume that things are always going to be faithful, because they're not unless you consciously try to address some of these issues.
There was an abstract bet you're familiar with. It was The Rise and Fall of Andover Seminary. And I remember having to read it many, many years ago, working on my doctorate, and John Hanna had us read it, and he just tracks how Andover Seminary, and then, of course, Princeton and Yale and Harvard, all of them go to seed. And you and I could name names. I mean, Saddle Pacific, perhaps, and there are other institutions we could identify going, they have shifted. I used to use the expression, organizations always list to the left. They never go to the right. And you're right, they have to be born again, I guess, each generation. But it's sad to watch, Carl Henry said, why did the liberals always get the buildings? Let's talk about inerrancy, because you bring this up early in the book. And this is another one of these whetstones that I remember the Council on Biblical Inerrancy. That was an index. And then one by one, Fuller and Seattle Pacific, and there were rumors Trinity before they dissolved. Others were playing with this term.
Yeah, I think this is a big issue for our time, and it was fought in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and because of groups like the Council on Biblical Inerrancy, I think again, that gave new life to, called people back to faith. And so this is the idea that, the Bible is absolutely true, and it's what I try to show in my book, because there's some debate today. People say, oh, inerrancy was just a modern invention. Well, no, it's not. And, obviously you can use different terms for it, but if you go back, and I show in my chapter 1, you go back obviously to the Bible itself, but the early church fathers, Catholics, Protestants, from the last 2,000 years, the major stream of Christianity until really our own sort of modern and postmodern generation, Christians basically affirm that the Bible was completely true in the things that it taught. And so this was fought back in the 1970s, and now we're having it again. And the disturbing thing now is it's coming from within evangelicalism and groups that actually say that they support inerrancy. So one of the people I talk about, and this is quite controversial because he has a lot of friends, and I think, again, he's a very sincere person, but Mike Licona. Mike Licona is one of the most noted New Testament scholars right now. He identifies as evangelical. He's very active in something called the Evangelical Theological Society, which explicitly says that it embraces inerrancy. That's like one of its only key defining marks. And yet he's a member in good standing. And what he is pushing in the last couple of books that he wrote, the latest last year, he's now calling flexible inerrancy, and it has nothing to do with inerrancy. But he's trafficking on the fact that he did do some good work on defending the resurrection, and so people are thinking of him as this orthodox figure. But what he's saying could have, I like to call it Jesus Seminar Light. Jesus Seminar was the group of theological liberals that would vote on whether a statement by Jesus in the Bible was really said by Jesus, and they usually voted them down. Well, what does Licona say? Well, he basically calls the gospel, they're like Hollywood movies that were inspired by real events, but that were then, loosely inspired by real events, where the gospel writers basically change the words of Jesus, make up new situations, fabricate stories, and all in purpose of their theological points, and all this is fine. And this is old-style theological liberalism dressed up as some new insight from, an evangelical scholar. And let's get down to really brass tacks. You mentioned the great I am statements in the Gospel of John. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father except by me. Well, according to Mike Licona, the Gospel writers were so free in changing things that we can't know how dramatically they rewrote what Jesus said, and so whether any of the I am statements are even historical. Or let's get even more specific. On the cross, we have the famous, historically Christians believe in the 7 last words of Christ, and some of those come in, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and some of them come in John. Well, so some of the gospel writers have Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which is a citation of Psalm 22, which is just a really tremendous prophetic psalm of what Jesus was experiencing on the cross. Well, John doesn't have that because the other gospel writers already wrote about that, but he does say that Jesus says, I thirst. There's no contradiction there. Jesus said both. Not according to Mike Licona. According to Mike Licona, without any evidence, just pulling a rabbit out of the hat, he says that, well, no, John rewrote, my God, why have you forsaken me?" and wrote it as, I thirst. Now, I'm sorry, that's not a paraphrase. Yes, we all admit that, they didn't have tape recorders. And so it's not that everything is absolutely verbatim what Jesus said. No, although I would say that if Jesus is saying, I am the good shepherd, those are really simple statements that would stick in your mind. And so I think those are probably pretty much as close to verbatim as you could get. But
And not to interrupt, the I am statements, the self-revelatory, all tie back to the Old Testament. They all tie back to the pericope of the individual who is blind. I'm the light of the world. Thirsty, I'm living water. Every single one of them, the good shepherd lays down. The theology is so rich in the tapestry of not only the Psalms, but all the way back to the self-identification. I am who I said I am. Anyway, we digress. But your point's well taken. I guess it's always intrigued me, and back to my earlier question to you, and you're right, we don't know people's hearts and motivations, but the reason we start nuancing these things, John, it's always the head scratcher to me. It's like, why am I accommodating either academia, culture, trend, social pressure? The whole scholarship and academic world is such an interesting place to fight and play and work, because the trends go so quickly and everybody just jumps on, as opposed to a guy like Francis Schaeffer saying, now, wait a minute, or a guy like John West saying, wait a minute, what are we doing here? And back to your original comment, you do have to have a backbone.
I do think, you do, and you need discernment. I think it starts when people get, some of it can be love of the world and wanting approval. And I do think that is strong.
Yes.
But I think it's also, at least in my personal experience, I think many of the people who go right, they genuinely do believe at, these wrong things, and they're overly influenced, and they trust that they're not particularly discerning. And so, and I think a lot of them struggle with their own personal doubts. Now, Mike Licona, I don't know him personally, but in interviews, he's talked about his long-term struggles and doubts that he's gone through. And so I think that, if you are struggle with that, then you are easy prey for, I'd say, the secularist elites, when and you begin to think, well, maybe they're right. They say that they're right. They say that these are academics at Harvard. These are academics who, claim to have a lot of this knowledge. And so you get fearful that they're right, rather than actually looking skeptically at the evidence. And the tragedy of Mike Licona is like the example I gave about, there's no contradiction at all. I mean, yes, there are, in the Gospels, there are a few things that may be hard to reconcile, and there are traditional ways of understanding those. But that's not what we're talking about with Mike Licona. When you say that the Gospel writers rewrote, my God, why have you forsaken me, as I thirst, you've just basically thrown out everything without any evidence. The thing is, there's no grounding for that. There's no contradiction there. There's really, and so where is he getting that from? Well, he's getting it from because he's really adopted wholesale these secularist professors' views that, that come from a standpoint that they don't really think the Bible could be supernatural because they rule out the supernatural. Now, Mike Licona won't, but he's adopting the views of the people who are driven by that. And so it is a strange thing, but I do think it comes out that from people's own insecurity, maybe from their lack of discernment, that they get overly influenced and they adopt those ideas as their own, as sort of the gospel truth, if you will, rather than the historic teaching of the church or the Bible. And I think that is sad. But it's certainly not something that Christians should be allowing to spread or adopt without challenging.
We barely got through chapter 1, and I've got 100 questions to ask you. I do want to dip in quickly to Francis Collins, because you spent a lot of time in your second chapter on secular science talking about Francis Collins. He portrayed himself, along with Russell Moore and David French and some of that I call them usual suspects, who came out sounding very clear, clarion, but as we uncovered things, whether it was Megan's research or just things that Francis said on and off record, it was really strange, John, to see how Francis, it was a house of cards.
Yeah. Francis Collins is interesting for a variety of reasons. Now, I can't speak to his heart, so I think... Right. I accept that he accepts Jesus as his Savior, but... and now... post sort of COVID scandals and other things, I think more people are a little more skeptical. But let's go back to the early 2000s, 2005, 2006, when he wrote his book, The Language of God. And he really was platformed by the evangelical establishment, not just the Russell Moores, but lots of pastors, lots of other people who didn't necessarily even read his book. Because why were they gravitating toward him? Well, because he was the Christian rock star type of person. He was on the cover of Time magazine because of his work on the Human Genome Project. And so, again, I think a lot of insecure Christians were thinking that, this helps validate our faith because this top scientist believes in Jesus. And so that makes us feel good. But my point is, as someone who early on was raising questions about Francis Collins, so I'm talking about like 2005, 2006, right. And how should I put it? The evidence was already there. I mean,
well, and
early on,
you cite his justification of eugenic abortions for Down syndrome children, embryonic stem cell research, NIH director. I mean, you go through it line by line, and this was again where it was the wolf in sheep's clothing. He was a poster boy, but to your point, we didn't look very deeply.
Yeah, the challenge is that I once was actually at a large megachurch where they were interviewing someone and the pastor who clearly would not have been sympathetic with some of Francis Collins' views, but he was touting Collins as this great example. And it was clear to me that he hadn't even read Collins' book, because had he done it, he wouldn't be touting him. And so it's also, Collins is interesting as a case study, not just for what he ends up doing, but how he was platformed, and all the people who because Francis Collins, lots of people write books. That doesn't mean that you become a evangelical superstar. So Francis Collins existed because he was platformed by a lot of people who should have known better. And then, what I write in the book, and really now became obvious for the 12 years or plus that he was at the head of the NIH, and then he became Biden's science advisor for a while. I mean, he was funding late-term abortions, harvesting body parts for tissue banks, doing research that was funded, like taking scalps from little babies and grafting them onto mice. Then on the LGBTQ area, they were funding the promotion of transgendered, what I would say, sex-destructive surgeries on young women and young men, to the tunes of millions of dollars to promote doctors and hospitals that were doing these things. And in fact, Francis Collins urged his employees to be, a fellow ally and advocate of the LGBTQ movement, and those are sort of specific terms of art, and to, so he was advocating that. And then, I also do have some criticisms of how he handled the COVID situation, realizing that Christians have a lot of differences of opinion on that. But I think he weaponized a very good biblical principle, which is love thy neighbor, as a bludgeon to basically attack as heartless, uncaring, even attributed that they were responsible for the killing of kids for those Christians who felt that they couldn't take the COVID vax. And I think that weaponizing of love thy neighbor in order to demonize, Christians who had sincere conscience-based, qualms about the COVID vax was also really troubling, to say the least.
Well, and granted, not the focus of your writing, but he came out even very recently, very in favor of some, very non-Christian LGBTQ things, and it's just disheartening that. Back to your premise, this is the Stockholm Syndrome, right? I want to jump over to your third chapter on sexual suicide, because this is perhaps one of the more egregious things we're facing in the next 2-3 decades, and if it can even be dialed back with the right voices at the helm. But you write about in 2019, all self-identified Christians now agree that casual sex between consenting adults who are not in a committed relationship, and the stats only get worse from there. The number of young couples and individuals, roughly 6 in 10 evangelical men, have more than 4 in 10 evangelical women have had 3 or more sexual partners other than their spouse. I was talking to the president of Summit Ministries. His name escapes me. It'll come to me in a second. About he's seeing a little hope in the 18 to 26-year-old men who are kind of coming back to a little more conservative view of marriage and sexuality and believing in the Bible. But boy, when you see what happened in the whole revolution, if you will, post-revolution, and you write about this, Adam Hamilton and others who were voices that we look to, John. But well, here we are. I'm prattling. Here we are.
Yeah, I would say that I intentionally start the chapter on sex with heterosexual promiscuity and the breakdown of marriage, because I think there are some theologically conservative Christians who they start with like gay marriage or transgender, and I think those, and I discuss those in the book too. But I think you need to understand, well, where did that come from? The breakdown, in fact, just this week in our family Bible study, we were rereading Romans 1, and it's really interesting how it talks about how cultures break down. And, first it's sort of a false view of the world, and then it talks about general breakdown in sexuality, but then after that you get the LGBTQ, and then you get further things. So I think that many Christians need to ask, well, how faithful are we being as heterosexuals, in areas of family and even and also things of divorce, because I think marriage is called to be permanent. And now this is not to say a lot of people who are divorced were sinned against by their spouse who maybe have committed adultery or left them. So I do understand that. Nonetheless, I've been in fairly theologically conservative churches in my lifetime, and I have to say that there's a real reticence even to speak out clearly on the issue of divorce, let alone sexuality outside of marriage. And so I think the good news, so I'd say that I think many Christians, we again need to get our own house in order. And if we're hoping for healing in the areas of the more extreme abuses like transgenderism and LGBTQ, is we first also have to look at, well, what are we doing about sexual purity, sexual faithfulness in the broader area, and marital faithfulness. And the good news, because I don't want people to think my book isn't just bad news. I go on to talk about solutions things, but the good news in the area of sexuality and is that there is some pretty good evidence that if you're a young person who actually believes that sex outside of marriage is not the right thing, if you are faithful in attending church and some other things, your level of action is much more biblical. You're likely to have fewer sexual partners and be much more likely to abide by biblical beliefs. Because I do think sometimes there's this misnomer that thinks, well, your hormones are raging, nothing can be done. That's not true. That is not true. And the research doesn't show that. The research shows that if you're intentional about discipling people in this area with faithfulness, and that they actually embrace those truths, that will have an impact on their behavior. And no one's perfect, that's right. But it's nonetheless, there is a dramatic difference. And in fact, one of the people I cite in the book, and I'd encourage if people are really interested in a deep dive on this, is David Ayers, Ayers, at Grove City College, published a book a couple of years ago that really does a deep dive into some of the latest statistics. And one of the things that he shows is that, again, it's not, sometimes people think that people fall away sexually and then that leads them to fall away spiritually. And no, it really is the other way around. Once you've adopted a lax view of Christianity, then that basically gives you permission to do all sorts of things. And that and the good news is that when you're really intentionally faithful about discipling people on some of these things, you can have dramatic changes in behavior.
We worked with family life marriage conferences for about 15 years, Cindy and I did, and the statistics, of course, they come and go, but one of the studies we would use was a heterosexual monogamous lifelong marriage. They do better financially, spiritually. The children are better suited for a life of personal responsibility. I mean, just take the baseline of Christianity and just say, keep your marriage together, be a good husband, good wife, work, pay your bills. Our friend here in Middle Tennessee, Dave Ramsey, talks about, couples that stay out of debt early have the happiest lives. I mean, there's just some very simple, as he says, God and grandma's way. If you do this the way God instructed, one man, one woman for life, you raise your family, take care of your kids, disciple them. And but we seem to always be running for the fence line. One of the things that I've been kind of on a mission, and you do a better job of it, far better, is the lack of clarity from some of these voices. And you talk specifically about Andy Stanley and Tim Keller, who I have a complicated relationship with Tim over the years, and I so appreciated the way you handled some of his sayings. But to me, and this was my complaint regarding Andy as well, it's not clear. And when you're not clear, it's not only unclear, but Howard Hendricks said, if there's a mist in the pulpit, there's a fog in the pew. And when we're not clear on positions and teaching, we leave too much room open. And Andy's anything but clear. Tim was very unclear on many issues in his life. To your credit, you cite a number of times when he kind of came back with more specificity. But again, for folks that aren't familiar, give them a little thumbnail of what you were investigating in this section.
Yeah, so let me just say a little bit about Andy Stanley, then I'll talk Tim Keller. So I would say that things often start with unclarity, but then they can progress. And I would say, sadly, I think Andy Stanley is pretty clear today. He's pretty clear.
Yeah, well, point taken.
On sexuality issues, but I think it started before then. And I just really encourage people to read the section of my book about his book Irresistible, which was praised by some people who shouldn't have praised it. Once you start bad-mouthing the Bible and saying that you can't defend it in culture and attributing, he basically says that we should reorder our Bibles and move the Old Testament to the back, and that everything bad Christians have ever done is this responsibility of following the Old Testament. And it's like, we are bound by God's word. We should revere it. Once you have an approach as a pastor that's almost a shock jock mentality of attacking the Bible, and yes, he comes back and says, he believes Jesus is Savior, and we follow the New Testament, and some of the moral principles of the Old Testament can be found in the New Testament. But again, just imagine, once you start having, I think this is one of my biggest gripes with Andy Stanley that I think was the biggest warning sign that led to further down the road where he got further off the rails. But once you start using the Bible as your foil, the Bible, especially the Old Testament, leads people to all these terrible things, which it actually didn't. And we can't defend it, and we can't do that. And then he's puffing himself up as, well, he's trying to convince the people who he thinks it's his responsibility to change people's hearts, and that if he just finds the right PR strategy for God, that he could convince the unbeliever to come in. Well, that's hubris. That is ultimately God's responsibility and God's Spirit, and we are not called to give up on God's word and sell it down the river so that we can hope that we can sort of snatch people into the kingdom. And so that whole approach should have set off huge warning signs for people. Now, and so I actually place Andy Stanley, who I don't know personally, but and I know you do, in a different category than Tim Keller. So Tim Keller was probably the most prominent theologically, faithful historically, Presbyterian.
In the Presbyterian circles, he was a very esteemed guy. Yeah.
And so he was looked up to. The church where I was an elder, one of the churches where I was an elder, we read his materials. We also read some of Andy Stanley's materials. They both are very influential, not just on ordinary people, but on training new generations of ministers. And the challenge with Tim Keller, unlike with Andy Stanley, when push came to shove, Tim Keller would defend, say, biblical sexuality. He would defend things, but he was unclear. He was talking out of both sides of his mouth or de-emphasizing certain things until he was really forced to clarify something. And so you have this, and I don't know him, but from the people that I do know who know him, I think that Tim was, he had this tremendous outreach in secular Manhattan. And I think that he too, if you look at what he was saying, it began to mimic what the secular culture around him was saying. And I think in his own mind, he probably thought that was how he was reaching these people. But the question is, what are you reaching them for? If you're reaching them, if they're agreeing to you because you're largely telling them what they want to hear, you're not really reaching them with the gospel. And so when it came to biblical sexuality, unlike Andy Stanley, he was a lot more faithful, but he also downplayed it a lot and sent conflicting signals. And I do talk about that in the book. And when it came to defending things like basic things like religious liberty in New York, this is a case that many people don't know about. But in New York City, there was an effort to basically boot churches. Primarily, these were poor ethnic churches who were renting school facilities like any community group could for their church services. And there was an effort to ban them from that, which meant that they really had no place to meet because New York is a horrifically expensive place. And some of these churches were actually given birth by Tim Keller's own church. But when that debate was happening, he was pretty much AWOL. He didn't defend the religious liberty of these minority churches around him. Now, when it got so much that people were writing articles about how he was absent, from this debate, he finally did put out a statement sort of late, but he really... He wouldn't even defend the rights or the needs of these congregations that his own church had helped start some of them. And those pastors were calling him out on that. And so Stanley is a really interesting character. And one other thing was, and this gets back to Francis Collins, an issue we didn't talk about, is Collins' whole idea of squaring Christianity with orthodox Darwinian evolution, which leads to some really strange ideas like, well, maybe, this was Collins in his book, The Language of God. Maybe God did guide things, but he made it look like a random and undirected process. Well, what do you do with Psalm 19 or Romans 1 or the whole Christian tradition that actually we can see the evidence of God's creative activity in nature? And then sometimes Francis Collins actually suggested that, well, maybe God didn't guide. He sort of goes off of both sides of his mouth on that. But here's the thing. Who helped, again, enable Francis Collins? Well, one of them was the Reverend Tim Keller, who held these private meetings for evangelical leading pastors and theologians to bring them together with Francis Collins for him to convince them of his heterodox views that when push came to shove, Tim Keller said he didn't believe in, but he was facilitating it. And in fact, I write in the book, this was never out publicly before, but I invited Tim Keller, got a Christian foundation that he respected, to hold a similar private meeting with leaders to give the other side. And we were sort of brushed off. And so Tim, I think I think he did a lot of good work, but he, especially in the last decade of his life, was a really indistinct trumpet, if you will, and talking out of both sides of his mouth on some things, and it was really tragic. You point out, and I've read through sections of the book, and they run together in my head. Forgive me, but one of the things about maybe it was Seattle Pacific having a debate on something as opposed to just forcing one issue. When I was at Moody, I encountered this with a particular professor, and they were issuing one book for the class, and I naively asked a student reading this book, I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Are you reading such and such?" Which would be sort of the, both sides. And they said, "No, this is the only text for the class." And the text was not only against the doctrinal statement in Moody. I went to the dean and I said, I'm not trying to kick the hornet's nest here, but it seems to me a professor, if that's what they believe, even though they signed a document saying differently, shouldn't they at least teach both sides? And shouldn't we as professors be teaching critical thinking, not this is the one way? And, academics as well as I do, people can sign documents and say all sorts of things, and they go in the classroom and all bets are off. And it's such an interesting, it's intellectually dishonest. It's lack of integrity as a Christian. But this idea of, I think our churches even would respect it more if you say, let's just say egalitarian, complementarian. If your church is sorting through that, read both books, have a good debate, study the Bible, and let the elders come to a decision and say, this is why. But it seems like indoctrination is more insular, more secure. I don't know. I'm prattling again. well, no. You've hit on an absolutely critical point. So why is it that whether it become inerrancy or sexuality or theistic Darwinism or a number of variety of issues, that so many people in the Christian church are veering off.
Left, yeah.
One of the key reasons is that, in fact, it's not that the truth has been debated and found wanting. It's because there hasn't been allowed to be any debate. And this is a theme throughout my book. And you're right, in the example at Seattle Pacific, they were promoting something called open theism, which is that God himself doesn't know the future. And this is not Orthodox Christianity. Okay, you're in a college, so you can study it. But I had students come in during my office. I was distraught because there was no other side given. The Orthodox side wasn't given. So it wasn't that the students were being moved against Orthodoxy because they studied both sides. They were being given one side to move them. Similarly with biblical inerrancy, there is a real lack of any reticence, there's a reticence. There's the lack of any willingness to debate the views of Mike Licona. So when Mike Licona's view, his book came out last year, giving this idea of flexible inerrancy, which really isn't inerrancy, Christianity Today, which used to be regarded as the main platform of evangelical Christianity, founded by Billy Graham, they published a lengthy, long review of the book that puffed it, that gave no criticism of it, and they didn't publish anyone on the other side. And Mike Licona, for the most part, doesn't engage with his critics a whole lot because he doesn't think they're worth engaging in. He's occasionally done that. And the idea is not that he should win the debate by presenting better arguments, but by not having the debate. Theistic evolution, again, with Francis Collins, when Francis Collins said he wanted to have a dialogue about, evolution among Christians. Not really. In these private confabs, and he did several over the years, he only invited one side, and he himself pretty much didn't want to share the platform with someone who was critical of Darwinian evolution, who could actually question. So in each of these areas, one of the key things, one of the reasons why there's so much slide is that there is no occasion to debate. And I'd say that one of the best things that a church can do, a Christian school can do, a Christian media outlet can do, is to force the issue and not allow us to just slide into heterodoxy without actually having a conversation about what's true. And so I think you've just hit it on the nail, because this lack of critical discussion where you actually can see the evidence for the Orthodox historic Christian view, that you're sort of predetermining the outcome by, if you basically don't really allow the Orthodox historic view to be, to be discussed or learned about.
Well, the book is The Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. Dr. John G. West, I highly recommend you take a look at this. It'd be a great gift to give to your outgoing college professor, an administrator, Sunday school teacher, a pastor, friend of yours. And one of the goals and hopes we have at inContext is that we take the life that you're living in the context where you are, and we're bringing biblical truth, biblical accuracy, critical thinking in this particular discussion to the table, so that we stand firm, we stand on the faith, we follow Christ with heart, soul, strength, and mind, and stop being the frog in the kettle.
Yeah.
Dr. John West, it's a privilege to have you on the program, and I hope you'll come back sometime in the near future.
I'd love to. Thank you, Michael.